Marcus Ellison was 39 years old the morning his wife packed his belongings into 6 brown boxes while he was still unconscious on an operating table in Charlotte Presbyterian. She had driven herself to the hospital, signed the consent forms his sister had already signed, and then returned home to begin disassembling 12 years of a life she had decided was no longer useful to her. The boxes sat on the front porch in precise, almost architectural rows. Not chaotic. Organized. The kind of packing that takes planning. The kind of packing that had started before the surgery was ever scheduled. What Denise did not know, what she had never thought to ask about, not once in 12 years of marriage, was who would be coming to collect Marcus from that hospital. She assumed he would call his brother Reggie, who drove a beat-up Silverado and would need 2 trips for the boxes. She did not account for the 3 black Escalades that pulled into the cul-de-sac at 11:40 on a Thursday morning. She did not account for the man who stepped out of the middle vehicle in a charcoal suit. Not Reggie. Not anyone she recognized, who began loading those boxes into the back of the 3rd vehicle without a word, while Denise stood in the doorway with her mouth open and her phone pressed against her chest. Marcus had $1 million sitting in a trust she had never been told about. He had a second company she had never seen. He had been quiet about both for 12 years, because quietness was the only language that had ever served him. What happened next would cost Denise every single thing she thought she had secured. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning of his surgery, Marcus Ellison had woken before his alarm. This was not unusual. He had been waking before alarms since he was 11 years old and sleeping in a twin bed he shared with his younger cousin in his grandmother's house off Beatty's Ford Road, where the radiator clanked before heat arrived and you learned to anticipate things because the things themselves rarely announced themselves politely. He lay still for a moment in the dark. The bedroom had crown molding he had installed himself, cut at 30-degree angles so the joints were invisible. He had measured 3 times, cut once. His grandmother Estelle used to say that patience wasn't about waiting. It was about refusing to move until you were certain. He had built that into him the way the joints were built into the molding, invisibly, thoroughly, without ornament. Denise was still asleep. She slept on her side now, facing away from him, which was not how she used to sleep. She used to press her back against his chest and fit there with a naturalness that had made him feel, in those early years, that God had built specific people for specific people, the way a craftsman builds specific joints for specific frames. He had fallen in love with her in the parking lot of a Home Depot in 2012, which was not a romantic origin story, but was true. She had been trying to load a set of pre-hung interior doors into a Civic, and he had stopped because he was a structural engineer who had strong feelings about particle board doors being transported horizontally. They had talked for 40 minutes. She had laughed at 3 of his 5 jokes, which was an above-average rate. He had been careful with her from the beginning, the way he was careful with everything worth caring about. He eased out of bed without waking her and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The kitchen was his work. He had taken it down to the studs in 2017, redesigned the load paths, installed the cabinets himself over 3 weekends. The tile on the backsplash was handmade terracotta from a small studio in Asheville. He pressed his thumb against one of the tiles now, feeling the texture, the slight imperfection of something made by hand. There was a satisfaction in that kind of permanence. In building something that would outlast the moment it was made in. He drank his coffee slowly. On the counter beside him, face down, was a folder he had not opened in 3 days. His lawyer, Vivian Marsh, had sent it over by courier. He had not told Denise about Vivian Marsh. He had not told Denise about the folder. He had not told Denise about a number of things, not because he was hiding them, but because he had learned, in the last 4 months, that there were things Denise herself had chosen not to share. His other phone, thinner and newer, was charging in his home office behind a locked door she had never asked about. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, set it in the rack. His grandmother had also said, "Do not borrow trouble. Let it come to you, and meet it standing up." He drove himself to Charlotte Presbyterian at 6 in the morning for the surgery that would repair the torn labrum he had been ignoring for 2 years, and he did not think about the folder, or the phone, or the 3 Escalades he had arranged to collect him, or what Denise might find herself doing on a quiet Thursday morning when she believed herself entirely alone. He had met her in that parking lot in 2012, and she had been 28 and funny and sharp. And she had not cared that he drove a used F-150 and wore shirts from Target and did not volunteer information about himself. She had seemed to find the quietness interesting rather than suspicious, which he had liked about her. He had been careful in those early years to be exactly what he appeared to be in most things. A structural engineer with a modest salary and a house he was slowly building into something real. He had loved her, genuinely, the way a man loves a woman he has chosen deliberately, and not by accident. What changed was not something he could name precisely. What changed was gradual, the way a foundation shifts, invisibly at first, then visibly, then undeniably. The phone she tilted away from him. The overnight conferences that began occurring in cities where her company had no offices. A new perfume she had not mentioned buying, floral and slightly unfamiliar, that arrived one Tuesday and never left. He had noticed each of these things the way an engineer notices anomalies, clinically, without panic, storing the data in an ordered way until the pattern became undeniable. The call that clarified everything had come from his cousin Jerome, who worked commercial fac in Dilworth and happened to be on a service call at the Kimpton Hotel on a Wednesday afternoon in February, when he walked past the bar and saw Denise sitting at a high-top table with a man he did not recognize, not sitting across from him the way colleagues sit, but against him, with her hand on his arm and her head tilted at an angle Jerome had never seen her use with. Marcus. Jerome had sat in his van for 20 minutes deciding whether to call. Then he called. Marcus had been in the middle of reviewing load calculations for a commercial project in Rock Hill. He had thanked Jerome. He had gone back to his calculations. His hands did not shake. He had driven home that evening and cooked dinner. He had eaten it across the table from Denise and listened to her describe a conference call she had been on that afternoon, and had not said a single word about the Kimpton or the man with his arm under her hand. He had watched her speak. She was performing for an audience that only existed in her own head. That same night, after she was asleep, he had gone to his office and unlocked the drawer where he kept a small external hard drive. He had been meticulous about what went on that drive over the next 6 weeks. He had downloaded 3 years of bank statements from the joint account, and the account she believed was hers alone. The account he had known about since she opened it in 2020. Because he was listed on a different account at the same bank, and the manager, who had processed his commercial loans for years, had mentioned it in passing without understanding that he was mentioning it at all. He had cross-referenced the withdrawals against the conference dates, the overnight trips, the unfamiliar charges at restaurants where she said she had eaten alone. He had built a timeline the way he built structural diagrams, methodically, without feeling, with an engineer's understanding that emotion was what you had after the work was done, not during it. $47,000. That was what the withdrawals totaled across 14 months. Not all at once. Never enough in a single transfer to raise a flag. Small, careful movements of money. The kind that suggested planning, not impulse. The kind that suggested she had been doing this long enough to have developed a system. He had opened his laptop on a Sunday night and created a new folder. He had named it simply Denise. Then he had called Vivian Marsh. Vivian Marsh practiced family law out of an office on South Tryon that looked like a living room, warm lighting, no fluorescent, real plants. She was 54 years old, short, unhurried, with the kind of manner that made you feel simultaneously calmer and more aware that everything was about to be very serious. She had reviewed the bank records, the phone screenshots Jerome had taken through the window of the Kimpton bar, the 3 instances of hotel charges on a card Denise had applied for in her maiden name. She had reviewed all of it without changing her expression. Then she had set the folder down and looked at Marcus directly. "She has no idea what's in your name," Vivian said. It was not a question. "No," he said. "She thinks the trust is a pension. She never asked." Vivian had looked at him for a moment. Then she had said, "People reveal what they value when they think no one is paying attention." "You've been paying attention for 12 years. She had opened her legal pad. "Let's talk about what we do with that." 3 days after his meeting with Vivian, Marcus drove out to the house on Roselle's Ferry Road, where his uncle Darrell had lived since 1989. Darrell Ellison was 71 years old, retired from 30 years at the power company, and had been present at every significant moment of Marcus's life. His father's funeral, his first commercial contract, his wedding. He sat in his kitchen with Marcus now and listened without interrupting. When Marcus had finished, Darrell was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at the pecan tree he had planted the year Marcus was born. "She married the truck," Darrell said finally. Marcus looked at him. "She married the F-150 and the Target shirts and the modest salary. She didn't marry you. She married the man she could manage." He turned back to Marcus. "The man she couldn't manage was always sitting right there. She just never thought to look." He reached across the table and pressed his hand briefly against Marcus's forearm. "Your grandmother used to say, 'A man who doesn't need to be loud is the most dangerous man in any room.' She was talking about your grandfather. She was also talking about you." He stood and got them both more coffee. "Let Vivian do her work. You do yours." What Vivian's work uncovered in the weeks that followed was not only the $47,000 from the joint accounts. It was another layer, a pattern that the man, whose name was Garrett Lowell, had run before. Garrett Lowell was a financial consultant in the South Park corridor who drove a silver Mercedes and had, according to records Vivian obtained through a colleague in civil litigation, been the subject of 2 prior complaints of financial misconduct from former partners, one in Raleigh, one in Greensboro. He had not been charged in either case because the complaints had been withdrawn. The withdrawals in both prior cases matched Denise's pattern almost exactly. Small, incremental, over long periods, routed through accounts the partners either didn't know about or had forgotten to monitor. Garrett Lowell was not a man who improvised. He was a man who had a method. He had applied that method to Denise, and Denise had applied her version of it to Marcus, and neither of them had considered, not once, that Marcus was the kind of man who kept receipts. Harold Priestley, the forensic accountant Vivian brought in, was 62 years old and had spent 20 years doing this kind of work for a firm in Charlotte before going independent. He wore reading glasses and spoke the way machines speak, with complete evenness and no unnecessary punctuation. He had spent 8 days building the financial map from the documents Marcus and Vivian provided. He set his findings in front of them on a Tuesday afternoon, 78 pages, tabbed, organized by date, with a 1-page executive summary at the front that described, in the plainest possible language, what had happened and what it could be recovered. The transfers were deliberate, Harold said. They began approximately 19 months ago. The account she used was opened 14 months before the first transfer, which means the account existed before the behavior. You plan a hiding place before you have something to hide. He removed his glasses and set them on the table. She was not impulsive. She was patient. Unfortunately for her, she was not as patient as you. He closed the binder. That was all. Vivian had filed the paperwork 3 days before the surgery. Marcus had signed everything from the hospital waiting room, on a tablet, with a stylus, at 6:15 in the morning, still in his pre-op gown. The timing was not accidental. Everything would be moving before Denise knew it was moving. Real power operated in quiet rooms. The 4 days between the filing and the surgery he had continued to come home and be exactly who he had always been. A man who cooked dinner and fixed things and moved through his own house without spectacle. He had asked her how her day was. He had listened. He had kissed her forehead on Tuesday night, and she had leaned into it without hesitation, which told him everything about the distance between what she understood and what was already in motion. He had sat across from her at that dinner table, the table he had built from reclaimed oak, each plank chosen and set by hand, and he had eaten slowly and passed the salt when she asked for it, and had said nothing about any of it. Because that was the work. A structural engineer who didn't want a building to fall worked from the foundation outward, in the correct sequence, without shortcuts. You didn't pour concrete while the footings were still settling. You waited. You let the work set. Then you built on top of it with confidence, because you had done the invisible part correctly first. Some things he had learned from his grandmother and from 12 years of structural work, and from everything that had followed Jerome's call, were worth the patience to build right. Marcus was in recovery when Denise arrived at Charlotte Presbyterian. He was told this later, by his sister Tricia, who had been there from the beginning and who had watched Denise sign the paperwork at the front desk. Not out of love, Tricia said, but out of something more like administration. Denise had sat for 40 minutes in the waiting room, scrolling her phone, and then had told Tricia she needed to run a quick errand and would be back. She had not come back. Tricia had received a text at 9:47 a.m. that said, "Tell him the boxes are on the porch." Tricia had stared at that text for a full minute. Then she had called the number she had been given. The 3 Escalades belonged to a security and logistics firm Marcus had retained as a client 7 years ago, and subsequently invested in substantially enough that he sat on its advisory board. The man in the charcoal suit was Dion Whitfield, the firm's operations director, who had grown up 4 blocks from Marcus and owed him a debt of the kind that could not be repaid with money. Dion had sent 3 vehicles because Marcus had asked for 3, and because Marcus was the kind of man whose requests did not require explanation. Marcus did not go to the front porch. He went directly from the Escalade to a hotel suite Vivian's office had arranged, because his home was now evidence in a proceeding and he had been advised not to re-enter it without documentation of what remained inside. He sat in that hotel suite for 2 hours with his left arm in a sling and drank water, and looked out the window at the Charlotte skyline and felt, for the first time in 4 months, something close to stillness. Denise was served the following morning. The process server found her at the Starbucks on Providence Road at 8:12 a.m. She was with Garrett Lowell. They were both served simultaneously. Denise with the dissolution and asset recovery filing, Garrett with a separate civil complaint Vivian had coordinated with the attorney representing one of his prior complainants in Raleigh, who had decided, upon learning of the Charlotte situation, that she was ready to try again. The 2 prior complainants had been tracked down by a research firm Marcus retained at Vivian's recommendation. Both had agreed to participate when they understood they would not be standing alone. The mediation took place 3 weeks later in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on College Street. Denise arrived with an attorney Marcus did not recognize. She was dressed carefully. She looked composed, briefly, until she saw who was seated on Marcus's side of the table: Vivian. The attorney representing the Raleigh complainant, a forensic accountant named Harold Priestley, who had prepared a 78-page report on the movement of the $47,000, and Marcus's uncle Daryl, who was present not in any legal capacity, but because Marcus had asked him to be there, and because Daryl had agreed without asking why. Denise's composure lasted approximately 4 minutes. It lasted until Harold Priestley opened his binder and began to explain, in calm and specific detail, how the $47,000 had moved: the account numbers, the transfer dates, the hotel charges, the coordination with Garrett Lowell's own accounts, which had been subpoenaed as part of the civil complaint. It lasted until Vivian produced the documentation establishing the existence and ownership of the trust, the secondary company, the advisory board position, the investment portfolio. Everything Denise had married without knowing, because she had never thought to ask, and had assumed the man in the F-150 was exactly the man in the F-150. Denise's attorney leaned over and said something quiet to her. She shook her head. She looked across the table at Marcus. "I made a mistake," she said. Her voice was controlled, but barely. "I know that. I know Mrs. Ellison." Daryl's voice was quiet and even. He had not spoken until this moment. He looked at her calmly. "You made a plan. Plans aren't mistakes." She closed her mouth. Marcus had been looking at her across the table. He did not feel rage. He had not felt rage at any point in the preceding months, because rage was expensive and imprecise, and he was an engineer, and engineers used what was useful. He felt, at this moment, an enormous and clarifying peace, the kind that arrives when a structure you have been building is finally complete, and you can see it whole. He gathered the papers in front of him and aligned their edges. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm clear. Those are different things." He stood, nodded to Vivian, nodded to Daryl, and walked out. Behind him the room was absolutely silent, and in that silence Denise remained at the conference table, surrounded by 78 pages of documentation, mapping the precise shape of everything she had miscalculated. 9 months later, Marcus Ellison was standing on the back deck of a house he had purchased in a quiet part of Mooresville, and was beginning to renovate, board by board, weekend by weekend, with no particular urgency. The morning light was coming across the lake at a flat angle. He had his coffee. His left shoulder had healed entirely, which his physical therapist had called remarkable, and which Marcus had attributed to following instructions. He had planted a Japanese maple at the edge of the yard last spring, and it was putting out its first real growth now, small, disciplined. Exactly as advertised. The deck he was standing on he had built himself over 3 consecutive weekends in late October, each board selected for straightness and grain, fastened with stainless screws he had ordered specifically because they would not rust and would not need replacing. He had done this not because it needed to be done immediately, but because the doing of it settled something in him. He had learned in the year behind him that men who spend their lives building things require the building itself, not as a metaphor, not as a substitute for something else, but as a basic condition of their own steadiness. He built because it was the clearest language he knew. Because in building there was no ambiguity about whether a thing was sound. Either it held, or it didn't. Either the joints were true, or they weren't. He appreciated that clarity more now than he ever had before. He was not alone. Inside, Renee Claiborne, who taught structural economics at UNCC and who had met Marcus at a conference in Raleigh 6 months ago, and who asked questions the way he had always wanted to be asked questions, with actual curiosity, without performance, was drinking her coffee at the kitchen island he had not yet refinished, because they had talked for 2 hours last Saturday about what wood to use and had not reached a conclusion, which was fine. She was not a woman who rushed toward conclusions. She gathered information with a patience that reminded him of his own, which was not something he had expected to find. She had asked him, on their 3rd evening together, what he was working on currently. Not at work, in general. He had thought about it for a moment, and had said, learning how to move slowly again. She had nodded as if that made complete sense. He had known then that this was a person who understood that some structures took longer to build than others, and that the length of the build was not a measure of the builder's failure, but of the structure's eventual permanence. What he knew about Denise came through Jerome, who still heard things. She was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Concord. She was working in accounts receivable for a mid-size marketing firm. Garrett Lowell had relocated to Greensboro, where the civil judgment had followed him. Her mother had stopped speaking to her in the months after the mediation, not out of cruelty apparently, but out of a specific and personal variety of shame. Her former network in Charlotte, the social architecture she had spent 12 years building, had compressed itself around its own center and quietly moved on without her. Marcus registered all of this the way a man registers weather, present, noted, not his concern. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it, and he had other things to build. He set his coffee down on the railing he had installed last weekend and looked out at the water. The morning was quiet. The maple was holding its color. Somewhere inside the house, Renee was humming something low and without identifiable tune, which he had come to understand was what she did when she was thinking. He listened to it for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee again and finished it, and looked at the lake and felt the warmth of the morning coming up from the water, and thought about what he would work on this afternoon, and did not think about anything that no longer required his attention. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.